Thanks, Eric. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. You could have dialed into any webcast panel, but you dialed into this one, and we appreciate it. My name is JWong. I'm a leadership coach and fractional VP of engineering, which is just a fancy way of saying consultant, and I will be your host for this session. Our panel today is about 30 minutes long, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. If you'd like to get in on the Q&A portion and pose questions to our panelists, go ahead and join the LeadDev live channel in Slack, and there should be a thread there for you to drop your questions in. And that's all of the formalities that we have for now. So let's just get into it. Just to make sure we're all in the right place, welcome to Finding Potential in Your Interview Process. Hiring engineers is hard, with over half of the C-suite executives saying that the future of their company relies on being able to source engineering talent. Making the correct decisions about who to hire has the potential to transform the fortunes of your company. The bad news is that interviewing and hiring is absolutely terrifying. You've only got a short amount of time with any candidate, and the consequences of your decisions will last a long time. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about how to establish the bar for hiring, create processes for interviewing different candidates equitably across multiple sites, develop tasks and questions that let you see a candidate's full potential, and finally, how to sell your company to your interviewees. To join us in this conversation, I'm super excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. First up is Dominique Simoneau-Ritchie. Dominique is Director of Engineering at Lever, where she focuses on growing high-performing teams to build the world's most collaborative recruiting platform. To establish Lever's first R&D teams outside of San Francisco, she adapted Lever's interview processes to set the bar across different locations, onboarded multiple engineers to Lever's approach to interviewing, and ultimately led over 100 interviews. This has resulted in building a team true to Lever's commitment to diversity and inclusion, in which 40% of the engineers identify as female or non-binary. We also have Clement Hogue. Clement Hogue is a front-end engineering manager at GitLab. He has a ton of experience working and hiring in an all-remote environment. He manages a global engineering team that spans almost all continents and led the revamp of GitLab's front-end technical interview process to raise the bar and reduce bias. And last but not least, we have Shannon Hogue-Brown. Shannon Hogue-Brown started her career writing software over 20 years ago and has moved through the ranks as an engineer and ultimately CTO. She is passionate about improving developer productivity so that dreams and innovations can be built. As head of solutions engineering at Karat, Shannon works closely with engineering teams to understand their hiring bars, align interviews to them, and create more predictive hiring processes. She lives in San Francisco with her two dogs, Samus and Lux. So thank you all for joining. I'm super excited for this. Let's just get straight into it. Shannon, let's start with you. Why is interviewing hard?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me. Interviewing is hard because it's not something that we practice for or that we train for. I know when I started my career, I got my first interview questions from a colleague, and then I proceeded to use those same interviewing questions for the next 10 years. Right? So interviewing is just like any other professional discipline. People get better at it with practice and consistency and training. And what makes it hard is that most companies don't treat it like other core competencies, right? I mean, most engineers don't have interviewing as part of their performance review or development plan, and it's not something that we train for or even mentor. And so that's actually what's really exciting about a place like Karat. It's a company that turns interviewing into a job. And I think with that same level of rigor and attention to detail, any other engineering team can have that kind of discipline.
Great. Clement, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Shannon did a good job explaining from a candidate perspective. I'll kind of talk about it from the hiring perspective. It's really hard because you have a limited window to evaluate a candidate on so many aspects, right? To be successful at a company, they have to be good in technical, understand the culture, and also work well with the team. And certain teams have different dynamics and makes it harder. So you're trying to evaluate all that in a short span of time. You're also trying to make sure that you're not keeping a candidate for a long time in the pipeline for the recruiting process. You don't want them to hear back 3 months later when they started, that they get an offer, because, competitive climate means people usually get their job offers very quickly. And so that I think that's what makes it really hard from the hiring side, is because of all those different aspects.
Right. I mean, something that I feel like is so true is something that Shannon mentioned. Like, how many of us ask the questions of our candidates that we were asked in our own interviews, and like, how does that, like, the survivorship bias that comes from that? How do you all break that cycle? Shannon, how have you broken the cycle?
Yeah, so I think what I've learned most recently is really that it's important to have a fair and predictive interview process. And so you really need to meet beforehand, talk about the competencies that you're interviewing for and how you're going to measure them, and having a very clear rubric. And then, Clement talks about, kind of the candidate experience. I think it's really important also to teach your interviewers how to set expectations. And so first, we know the competencies that we're looking for. These folks are going to ask these questions. We have a very clear measurement. And then when you get into the interview itself, make sure to let the candidate know. If you're looking for someone who can optimize code, let them know that they should optimize. If you're looking for somebody who can just get through the questions, let them know that you're looking for them just to get through the questions as quickly as possible. That kind of ambiguous space is super uncomfortable, and it's really important to let the candidate show their best selves.
Dominique, that answer seemed to resonate with you a bit. What are you thinking about?
I mean, I think ultimately interviewing is about building a relationship with someone, because ultimately they may not be a fit for your company or that role at this time, but they could be later. And so, when I've been thinking about when we went ahead and built our process to interview remotely for the first time and build out the Toronto team, we really designed it around candidate experience. And a few things that our team did when we were first interviewing remotely were in person, not in person, but over the phone check-ins, so informal. So versus letting a candidate know, hey, we're about to schedule an interview, because you wouldn't get that personal connection during the interview in the same way, we actually had informal check-ins. And for panels, we actually even planned for breaks between interviews so that they would get a similar experience.
Nice. So thinking about the interview process, Clement, like, how do you know your interview process is working?
Yeah. I think similar to what Shannon was talking about, what we do at GitLab is we try to measure kind of what specifically we're trying to determine and evaluate in each stage. And so we try to create, with rubrics, try to evaluate how candidates are performing as a pool, so that we can determine like percentage of people that pass, a percentage of people that do well in certain metrics. That will allow us to really understand whether people are going in the pipeline correctly, whether we're like not everyone's going through and not nobody's going through, and trying to find that good balance. So having good rubrics, good dashboards to report on kind of the progress, and having those feedback loops. So sometimes for me personally, sometimes we have rough interviews where maybe it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, or just like a not great candidate experience. So we take that experience and see, like, is there something we could have caught earlier on, or something we can improve in the process? So that mindset of continually iterating on the process, realizing that your process is never like perfect and there's always room for improvement.
Great, thanks. Shannon, what about you? How do you know your interview process is working?
Yeah, for us, with the folks that we're working with, we take a lot of looks at data over time, in particular the on-site to offer ratio, and then the funnel metrics that kind of, form that ultimate outcome. And I think what's great is, as Clement is talking about, having scoring rubrics, what that does is it starts to enable you to make data-driven decisions around the interview process itself, like the actual interview, which, previously I didn't even know that we should be doing that. But ultimately, that data point is really important in that funnel metric in order to, increase that on-site to offer ratio, which is what we're all looking for.
Something that we looked at a lot was our screen to hire ratio. And that screen to hire makes a huge difference. And what we were finding is that we were screening a lot of people in. And actually the panel to hire ratio was also something that was quite high. And by adapting our skills screen to be more representative of the same skills that get evaluated later on, we were able to bring in some of that earlier and then not take up a lot of time for people who might not be a great fit for the role that we're looking to fill.
Interesting. What is a healthy screen to offer ratio, or like is there a magic number? Like what have you all been finding?
Ideally, one that trends down. We keep ours around 20 or so, but that depends on the type of role. For an engineering role that you hire very consistently and predictably for, it should be low. But for a role that might be new to your company, like we've just created a QA lead role, we don't really necessarily know exactly if our rubric has been defined correctly. And it's important to monitor that to be able to go back and say, okay, did we define the criteria well? And therefore, are we screening the right people?
Yeah. Shannon, what about you? What's your ideal screen to offer ratio?
Oh gosh. Well, for me, this is different with every company. I completely agree with Dominique that this, as long as you're trending down, I think that's the best outcome that you can have. Look, there are some companies, they're going to scoop up talent. They're going to get them really quickly through the funnel, and their on-site to offer ratio is going to, dramatically change. Sometimes that on-site to offer ratio is going to stick up pretty high, like 20-1. But I would say if you can get yourself down to, 2.5, 2-1, you're in a really, really, really good spot. But I think Dominique can probably speak to that a bit better.
Yeah, we aim for 3-1 as our panel to offer ratio.
Wow, that's awesome. Great, thank you. Switching topics a little bit, this one's for you, Dominique. Given current events, what are some of the tips you can give folks on how to turn their on-site centric interview process into a distributed/remote centric process?
So I think going back to candidate experience, really thinking about what might be challenging about that scenario and making sure that you're building in the time to build that relationship. So I talked about a couple of things before, but also having a single Zoom or remote interview link so that they don't have to worry about where they're going to be joining and how they're going to manage the technical aspects of the event. Even one of our customers, Rollbar, they actually provide candidates with information on what to do if something goes wrong, how to contact the interviewer if for some reason you get disconnected. So planning ahead for those difficult scenarios. And also thinking, I love this, Rollbar did this as well, as like handoff experience. So asking them if they need a break. Like, what would you do if they were on site with you? You'd be, hey, do you need to take a break? Do you need to grab a glass of water? Do you want to walk around for a minute? And so they do the exact same thing, and they supplement it by having a Slack channel. And that Slack channel, the interviewers can chat with each other. They say, oh, the candidate wants to take a break. They'll be ready in 5 minutes, and then you can jump on.
Wow, that's awesome. That's great. Clement, I'm sure you have a ton of experience with this, working with a fully distributed team. What are your tips and tricks?
Yeah, I really liked what Dominique said. I think that was really great. For GitLab, we do all remote, and we don't do like panel, like back-to-back interviews. So we actually schedule them one at a time, and that has trade-offs for sure. I'd say the best part you can do for kind of moving to a remote-centric process is to kind of be really big in communication, write things down as much as you can, and try to set up the candidate for success. Just trying to be more verbose than you would normally in a more on-site interview process.
Great. Something that we've talked a lot about is sort of this candidate experience, right? Something I see a lot in interviews is this idea that the interview is a test, right? Where we place the onus of success on the candidate. But some of the best interviews that I've been a part of and that I've participated in recognize that interviewing is a two-way street, right? So Shannon, what can interviewers do to help candidates show off what they really can do? Like, how do you help your candidates shine?
Yeah, I love this question. I'm all about candidate experience, and we're all about a candidate experience. And our motto is that a good interview process is one that is predictive, fair, and enjoyable, right? So, first, I want to touch a little bit on this one, what Dominique was talking about, which is that kind of setup before the interview itself, any A/B testing that needs to be done. We have like a candidate environment. If you're going to have paired coding, which, is prominent right now in the times, which I do suggest having a paired coding environment and having a conversation, working through a problem, make sure that they have access to that environment beforehand. Give them some kind of sample questions that they can code in that environment. Because for developers, when you go into a different IDE, it's like getting in someone else's car and trying to drive, and you want to set them up for success. And then once you get into the interview, warm people up, have a conversation, do a 5-minute introduction before you get to coding, potentially ask some kind of warm project specific questions, some knowledge questions about something that you're looking for, competencies like maybe React or front end development, and then work towards that, that coding environment where you're doing that structured kind of paired coding. And I think we touched on it before. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but certainly set expectations, make sure that the candidate understands what you're looking for before they actually start the exercises.
Great, awesome. Dominique, what about you? You mentioned a bit about handoff. Like, what are the other ways that you can help candidates be successful?
I mean, the setting expectations, especially on a technical level, is so important. We have pair programming interviews, and I think most companies have pair programming interviews. But what's different about ours is that we're truly looking to see how you collaborate with us. And we might even jump in to help you. Some of the people that we've hired have been really surprised to see that. And so letting people know that we expect you to look things up on the internet and that we will jump in is really important. And on a really specific, like actually telling them and giving them permission. So it's not just like having something pretty generic, but actually telling them specifically what you're expecting.
Nice. And then Clement, while you were redesigning the front-end engineering interview experience at GitLab, how did you incorporate candidate experience?
Yeah, so we were at GitLab, we're really big on iterations. So we actually had a long-term strategy of how we wanted to implement the new process, and then kind of like how we can make our progress there. And then throughout that time, we were getting a lot of feedback from candidates. So just kind of a big overview. The new process involves first we have like a test project, and candidates would receive kind of a merge request that's kind of work in progress for a new feature of the test project. And then candidates would have to review the merge request for like an hour prior to the interview session. And then during the interview session, they would fix the MR and kind of take the feedback that they were giving earlier and implement them. And during the first iteration of this process, we didn't want to have too much time spent before the interview, so they actually just reviewed the merge request during the interview. And that was a really tough candidate experience because candidates really want to have that on their own time. And so we got a lot of feedback through that process saying like, hey, like I didn't really feel like I was able to shine. And then after we implemented the process where candidates fixed the MR during the interview, I started getting emails saying like, hey, that was like the best interview process I ever had. Like it really let me demonstrate my abilities. And I was like, wow, like this is really great feedback. So that's kind of our feedback loop as well.
Great. Something you touched on there and that we've talked a little bit about is sort of technical skills assessment, right? And this is an area where I see a lot of folks struggling right now, right? Like, traditional whiteboarding has its well-known flaws. Take-home assignments, can be viewed as unpaid labor and not something that everyone has time for. Clement, like, where do you sit on technical assessments and how to do them?
Yeah, I think that like take-home assignments are really effective because it simulates like real world as much as you can. You can set it up for that compared to whiteboarding, but it has huge trade-offs. Like it really marginalizes people that come from usually like more diverse backgrounds. So like if you imagine like a single parent with kids, like that's going to not give them a chance to be as successful as maybe someone that has come from a more privileged background to have the resources to dedicate like full attention on a project. So I'm definitely try to stay away from that as much as possible, but we're also recognizing that there are some benefits. So for GitLab, we try to find a little bit of a happy medium. If you can, try to find ways to support kind of like, what is it like? So there's trade-offs for take-home assignments and try to mitigate them. So for example, at GitLab, we are willing, if they don't have like a fast computer, we're willing to like send them one for the interview. So stuff like that could help mitigate that and make it a little bit better. I've had one interview in the past at a previous company where they actually paid me to do the take-home assignment, so that helps also. But that also doesn't scale very well, depending on what your company is trying to do. So it's definitely a touchy subject, but I think that it's important to know the trade-offs there.
Great. Dominique.
So we split our interviews up into two general types. So one where we try to assess based on their explanation of work that they've already done, and the other where we mimic real work as possible, which of course has its different ways of doing it, and we do it quite differently. But so for the ones where we rely on the explanation of work that they've done in the past, we one of them is the project interview, and so we have them walk through a project interview, and this is a great opportunity for us to highlight some of the skills that they might have that relate a lot more to our culture and how we work. So Lever is a very collaborative company. We really emphasize communication, capturing, documentation, and the project interview is a great way to highlight and to see whether somebody falls into those categories. And we actually emphasize non-technical skills during this interview. So we try and make sure that we steer people towards highlighting projects that really are about how they collaborate with others. And actually for whiteboarding, we do something similar. So instead of having them, I think we've all asked to design Twitter or design Facebook. But instead of doing that, what we do is we ask somebody to talk about a project that they've worked on. And this has the benefit of requiring less practice, less prep, but also you can assess their true communication skills, because as an interviewer, you're most likely not going to be familiar with that system. And you really get to understand how they communicate something that they're very familiar with and that you're not, and where their boundaries of knowledge are. And on the mimic side, so in terms of mimicking real work, something that we do is the code review interview. And I absolutely love it because it's a great way to assess somebody's ability to be in a technical leadership role. So in our rubric, the way that you get a grade here, I guess I'm spoiler alert, is that you think about how your feedback will impact the person receiving it. And what does that mean for their growth? And sometimes you might even adapt what feedback you give them. Maybe there's some feedback you don't give them because of how it could impact them. And that also takes less preparation because it's something that most developers do in their day-to-day jobs.
Wow. That's the first time I've ever heard about that as part of a rubric. That's awesome. That's great. Shannon, so how does technical skills get assessed at Karat?
Oh yeah, gosh. I mean, so my job's really cool. I get to work with a ton of different companies, and we have a couple of different ways in which we can kind of adjust the process to those companies. And hopefully by showing you the levers that we can pull, you can start to kind of assess what levers you would pull. But the two ways we do that is first the competencies themselves. So what content will we be asking? And all the content is very specific. There's very specific scoring rubric around that. We have about 72 inputs during the interview process, actually, in order to kind of not score, but assess the candidate. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And then the second piece is really understanding what your technical bar is over time. So as you start to take a look at those funnel metrics, you look at your on-site to offer ratio. And then if you have a structured way to score, like a drop down on feedback on how the candidate was assessed, you can start to look at the notes from the developers and the team leaders on whether or not, after that person was interviewed, obviously, and seeing whether or not that person was offered a position, and kind of look at that against the competencies and their assessment for those. I don't like to say scoring. I think it's impersonal. I hope you agree. But the assessment for each of those competencies, and then start to adjust. And you can say, okay, well, this candidate's really good, so potentially we should kind of hone in more on the React questions versus the coding questions, which didn't give us as much signal. So it's really important to have the data in place, especially for us at the volume that we're doing, the data in place in order to kind of drive figuring out what that technical bar is, and then figuring out, okay, at that point, I know my bar. Do I want to raise the bar? Is this the bar we were really looking for? Are we getting the diversity that we're looking for? And is this a measurable and consistent experience for the candidate?
Awesome. Speaking about bars, I think one of the questions that we're getting a lot right now in the Slack channel is questions around bias, right? And what are some things that we can do to counter bias in our interviewing process? Clement, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the making sure you're very clear about your expectations. I know we've repeated this a few times already, but being very clear what the interviewer is trying to look for can reduce the bias in kind of like what they're asking for, what they're evaluating. So back in the past when GitLab was a little bit smaller, kind of our interview process was just kind of like do your best to determine whether this is a good fit for the company. And when that was just the premise, there wasn't any specific evaluation criteria. Each interviewer kind of came up with their own questions that they borrowed from previous experiences. And though it was better than nothing, it did create a lot of bias in the interview process. So like some people would pass a lot more people than others. Maybe a candidate is really good in testing, and then the interviewer is really passionate about testing. So then they have a bias towards that and leads to this person moving on forward compared to if someone else was interviewing. So being really clear on that, I think, is a great start for removing bias.
Nice. Dominique, how about your interview process? Like, what are the ways in which you've countered bias in your interviews?
I think the rubrics have been the most important, especially for me. So I most recently interviewed a lot of engineering managers, and that's a role in particular that's very behavioral to interview for. And actually, I find it quite challenging to interview. And so with that, having a rubric where I had really thought through each of the qualities and then what the difference between good and great looked like, and also having a really good idea of what a good answer is. So especially for behavioral interviews, it's really easy to just have a conversation and feel like, wow, I really connected with that person. That's not what you're interviewing for, though. You're interviewing for actually specific skills and qualifications and like what they could do in the role. And so being able to go back to that rubric is really important. And to do that successfully, taking notes that are observations versus your feelings or what you think that you interpreted. So writing down observations throughout it so that you can look back at those notes a day later against your rubric and better make a decision that is not in like the feeling of the moment.
That's great. Rubrics are really interesting. I feel like I've always been a proponent of rubrics, and then when I go down to sit down to create a rubric, I feel like I'm just making it up. Like I have no way of knowing if my rubric is good or not. If anyone is willing to volunteer, like what does a good rubric look like? How do you know what's like good versus great? We'll start with Dominique.
I look at people who successfully have one of those qualifications, and I also look at our performance evaluations, because ideally, if somebody passes the interview process, they're also going to be great at performance evaluation time. And so, for instance, like technical leadership is one of our qualifications, or one of the things that we look at for performance. And so we do the same when we're assessing an interview to come up with what that should be. Often the difference between like great and good will be nuance. So somebody that can provide multiple examples or that has experienced it and been able to adapt in a particular environment. And that truly is for most of when I come up with a particular, like, should this be good, great, or not good at all? It'll be kind of the level of experience. But ultimately, I think what's challenging is even just coming up with those competencies or skills. And so if you look at other people around you and you look at your performance evaluations, that's a great way to start.
Awesome. Shannon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I completely, as always, agree with Dominique. I think reverse engineering, this is important. From a tactical standpoint, if you're asking coding questions, if you have 3-part coding questions, certainly you can have a pretty structured rubric around how far they get through the exercises, as long as your 3-part coding questions are balanced, right? So balance meaning if, they answer the first question and they decide to go one direction versus the other, they aren't going to get too caught up in the second question, not be able to get through. So just making sure and testing the content that you have. I guess the only other thing that I would say about rubrics, communication, just be clear about what communication means to your team. Does communication mean, okay, they were clear in their feedback, or is communication more subjective, like, oh, I really, enjoyed my conversation with this person? So I completely agree that you should make observations rather than conclusions. An observation that is like, oh, the candidate was able to write fully functional and organized optimal programs for the first 2 questions with moderate debugging for the third, something like this, rather than a potentially bias-inducing conclusion that looks more like candidate X had several time-consuming bugs, in early questions, and as a result, they were unable to complete. So, just making sure that everybody understands the language that should be used to describe the candidate performance and agree upon that beforehand should help.
Yeah, one of the questions that we're getting in the Slack channel is one around culture fit. Like, how do we prevent culture fit from being a dog whistle for discrimination and bias and those types of things? Like, what does that? How do you express that difference to your interviewers? Clement.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's culture fit has gotten a bad rep. That term, I have seen it used as a way to box people out. I think it's important to recognize the actual purpose that it originally was meant to intend. So an example would be for GitLab, we're working in an all remote environment and it's very async. So in order to be successful, you usually have to be someone that takes ownership really easily, kind of be able to take a task and kind of run with it and be willing to follow up with people. But if you don't really demonstrate that, then you probably won't be very successful at GitLab. Not necessarily as like trying to say you can't come because of culture fit, but you just wouldn't be set up for success if you didn't kind of have these kind of behaviors.
Dominique, Lever has had great success in hiring a diverse team. What has been, how have you all expressed that difference between culture fit versus values and bias?
What's interesting for me in terms of like even joining Lever to start to interview to build this team is one of the things I had to really do is get familiar with Lever's values so that I could successfully then assess whether people could join us and really help add and build that similar culture in a new location as well, because we were opening up the Toronto office. And so all of our interview training, I didn't get the interview training at first, so I had to teach myself. But then it turns out that so now as I onboarded, so that's something that I put in place is all of the interviewers that we've trained in the last year now have interview training that one of our amazing recruiters put together, and that teaches them about all of Lever's values and what they mean and how you might be able to identify them. And so for culture, we actually look for culture ads. So what are ways that they might complement us? So and that value is raising the bar. So raising the bar for Lever means you're adding something that we don't currently have as part of our culture or our skill set. If you're trying to become more metric driven, then that might mean hiring someone that's really experienced with like reporting and driving change from metrics. But that could look completely different based on whatever role or whatever team and where we're trying to go as a company.
Nice. Shannon, how about you?
Yeah, I just wanted to, again, culture add. There's so many bias and inducing questions that we can ask. So for example, assuming somebody's familiar with some, topic that they learned at MIT may exclude folks that came from, code academies where they want to change their lives and they're working really hard to be a part of technology, and they can add so much to the culture and changing the way that we're thinking. I think that's to me most important. But the second piece really is, I think you have to be able to take a look at your data. Again, programmer, right? So I think you have to be able to take a look at that data over time, right? And have honest conversations with yourself. So if you have a very structured scoring rubric and you know exactly what your technical bar is, and you're bringing in, because Dominique and her teams and the, of course, the TA teams are bringing in the candidates that are diverse, and you're starting to see, okay, yeah, these diverse candidates are hitting our technical bar. They're moving forward in the process, but then there's a drop off and we're only hiring what we have here today, which, we know that there's probably an issue. So what I would say is make sure you have that data in place, monitor that data over time, and then, be willing to have the hard conversations about why there's a drop off in those more culturally diverse candidates versus the others.
Yeah, that's great. Something that I really love about like the language of culture add is that it primes actually the organization for change, right? Understanding that as you bring in new candidates, as you rehire new employees, you're embracing the fact that your culture is going to change and it's going to morph and evolve over time, rather than this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, this is our key to success. It's like, no, times change, context changes, and we need to change with the times. That's awesome. Thank you all very much. Let's spend a quick few minutes talking about closing candidates. What are some of y'all's best tips and tricks to close? Clement, let's start with you.
Could you define what you mean by closing?
You have a candidate that you're super excited about. You want to make sure that they join your company. They may have competing offers. They may be interviewing with other folks. You may want to how do you do your best job to pitch your company?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is being personable. So we try to have the hiring manager, director kind of reach out to the candidate and say like, hey, like we want you to join. Like I want to make myself available. Here's my calendar. We can talk more about the role. I also have a README as a manager. I know that some people are big on that, some people are not. But having something like that also helps try to sell in some ways, like your team and why they would why they should join your company and your team.
Awesome. Shannon, tips on closing.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think about one of my colleagues, our head of diversity and inclusion at Karat. Her name is Portia Kipple-Smith, and she likes to say that retention starts at the interview, and every interaction with your team that the candidate or employee even has with the employer brand after the interview is kind of a byproduct of that interaction. So I would say, set the stage with everything we've been talking about here. Be clear in your expectations, have a fair process. Don't, encourage bias or induce bias into the process. The other piece that we do is once we have that kind of structured rubric in place, we understand what our bar is, we start to see the folks that are well above bar. Part of selling your company is really getting folks in a room with your developers, your brain trust, the people that they're going to be working with. And of course, we focus on tech hires. So I am speaking about tech hires. But essentially getting, the candidates that people are most excited about into a room with your developers that they're going to be working with and learning from and just geeking out a little bit always is pretty much a big sell. I think again, start with something that's fair, predictive, positive, enjoyable, and then work that process all the way through and get them in with your developers who ultimately are the folks who are going to sell or close the candidates.
Awesome. Dominique,
on top of
tips.
that, yeah. So, listen. So each candidate is on their own personal journey and looking to learn something and looking for something new. And in some cases, actually, they're not looking if you're doing a great job of connecting with people. And so I always go back and look at notes and try and understand where are they on their personal journey and what is the thing that they want to learn. And that doesn't just help me close the candidate. That also helps me with my own team planning to figure out how will this person continue to be a great team member and help us as a company succeed.
Wow. I love that. I feel like when I think about selling, I immediately go to what can my company, why is it great to work in this company? But I feel like I so often forget what does the candidate need? How do I meet the candidate where they're at? So awesome. Let's go turn to questions real quick. One of the questions we have in Slack is, how do you interview for seniors/leads in respect for the softer skills and behaviors like influencing peers? Dominique.
So I think, our code review interview is probably the best one for this, where we really look about their thought process and how they communicate technical information when they're mentoring someone. It's such a great opportunity to see how they do that from a technical perspective. We also do this in our project interview, where we learn how they've interacted with others, and we try to really identify some of how they might speak about something. So, they had to work with another developer. Did they understand? Were they empathetic with regards to how that developer, what they already knew or didn't know? Some of the best places, the best people who've done really well in these interviews, they demonstrate this person was trying to learn JavaScript, and so I worked with them and coached them on that aspect of it, for instance.
Gotcha. Nice. Clement.
I think Dominique summarized it pretty well. I don't really have too much more to add.
All right, Shannon, how about you?
Yeah, I absolutely. Dominique did a great job. The only thing that I would say, what I look for, I have a particular management style when I'm hiring developers. I'm looking for folks who want to work with people or hire people smarter than them, right? And to give them the tools that they need to do their job and see where they want to go in their career and help them succeed. That's my management style. So the folks that I'm usually looking for when I'm hiring developers are the ones that talk about, especially leads, that talk about their teams when they're talking about their projects, or their, they talk about how important it is for them in their career to become a leader. And they ask questions about, wow, is there an opportunity to learn management skills? And they respond when I give them my management style and say, oh my gosh, I love that. I'm really excited about mentoring and so on and so forth, right? I'm listening, like Dominique would say, and I'm listening for those cues that it's not really all about them. Although, yes, they want to showcase, but they realize that what you're showcasing isn't just your own skill, but you're showcasing that, kind of team effort that it takes in order to build something beautiful.
Awesome. Another question that we're getting is sort of interviewing across sites, whether it's across borders in different countries or multiple offices. Dominique, what are some of the experiences you've had in terms of scaling interview processes across sites?
So we made it a plus because you are going to be working together across sites anyways. We designed our interview panel so that there would be a remote portion of it, because we felt that from an experience perspective, you were experiencing what real life would be like. Once you join Lever, you will collaborate with our team in San Francisco, and you must want to work with those people. And then but then we still ended up making sure that they could connect on a more personal level with the people that they see day to day, which maybe is a little bit less relevant right now. And so for me, it's more about how do you incorporate or like leverage it in a way that makes the most sense for your team.
Awesome. Shannon.
Gosh, yeah, I completely agree. I think, for us, it's everything that we've talked about: structured scoring rubrics, setting expectations. Everybody knows what competencies that they're interviewing for. But I think we have to think about, what's interesting right now. I was doing a talk, and I was speaking with somebody where it's a podcast. And so we were trying to set up time, and he was located on the East Coast, and I was like, oh, wow. So I can get up super early and we can work in the morning because I'm a morning person. He was like, I'm at home. And so morning now for me is kid time. Right. And so we all need a little bit of flexibility. So having that distributed team actually gives that flexibility. So you don't just force the 8-hour, interview block that people are used to. In fact, at Karat, we're 24/7, and over 60% of people take advantage of nights and weekends. So it is, unfortunate, and I apologize to sound positive during this time. I don't mean to be insensitive, but it is really, you can take advantage of the fact that people are home. You have a global team and offer people those nights and weekends, especially now where folks are having to take care of their kids. We need to be more empathetic and sympathetic to where, the fact that people are home and they may not have childcare and they have other concerns going on in the world.
Gotcha. Clement, GitLab is fully distributed. What are some of the things that you've done to sort of standardize processes across the organization?
Yeah, so we're really big on documenting. So a lot of the process is already written out in the handbook, so people can actually look at it if they're interested in mimicking it or understanding it. So we have kind of like two documentation, one that's outward facing, one's more internal about kind of more the rubric and the scoring that unfortunately cannot be public at this time. But having those detailed helps us scale it and be consistent to across continents, countries. Different interviewers can kind of get on the same page easily.
Nice. And one more question from the Slack. What are some good practices to reduce the time between screen and hire, like the time it takes for an entire interview process? How do you get that down to a manageable level? Dominique.
We try to really be proactive with regards to getting feedback. I personally recommend to people to sleep on it so that they don't have those emotions. But that means that like the next day you're ready to look at your rubric, enter the feedback, and do really quickly, and then get back to the candidate within 24 hours. That's like 100%. Get back to the candidate within 24 hours for all interviews, unless there are real circumstances that don't make sense, or that you need to accommodate for. Yeah.
Awesome. Shannon, I'm sure Karat has all sorts of data on this.
We do. And in fact, it's really important to get folks through the funnel as quickly as possible. You know, one of the problems I always had that I felt was always difficult in my career was scheduling. You know, really trying to wrangle all the cats. You know, one way that Karat deals with this is that we do have this widely distributed and kind of, you know, trained team of folks that are available 24/7. So one thing that I would suggest is just, you know, don't limit those interviews to just a few folks that are good at it. Train, you know, all of your engineering teams to be able to interview, have the standards in place so that it's a consistent interview, even if you have to reach outside of the team. Let's say, for example, somebody's sick. And then, you know, the logistics of it that team members deal with tend to get a little bit easier for folks. Also be flexible again in that timing. So if you have people in different time zones, certainly try and take advantage in order to make, you know, it possible for people to interview nights and weekends. We can all only take so many dental appointments during the week as we're looking for work. And so we don't want them to suffer in those cases. But again, I mean, for me, it always just comes back to having that structured rubric and having the training in place for your team so that, you know, everybody knows exactly what their competencies are interviewing for, what questions they'll be asking, or at least what catalog of questions they'll be pulling from. And so you can swap people out and you don't get the logistics problem. And then the third is, once you get a great candidate, just get the communication going, be honest, bring them on site as quickly as possible, get them with your developers as quickly as possible. Don't wait because the great candidates are getting pulled, especially in Seattle, you know, San Francisco, New York, they're getting pulled in 100 directions and you can lose a candidate pretty quickly.
Awesome. Your comment on scheduling reminds me to give a big shout out to recruiting coordinators, one of the hardest jobs ever on the planet. It's crazy. Big shout out to the recruiting coordinators out there. Awesome. We have a few minutes left. We'll do a quick lightning round before we wrap up here. What's the most impactful change you've made to your interview process? Clement, we'll start with you.
I think standardizing our technical interview process. It's not perfect, but recognizing that we're consistently looking for ways to improve.
Awesome. Shannon.
Always keeping in mind that we should make every single interview fair, predictive, enjoyable. That make sure I have my ABCs are fair, predictive, enjoyable for me.
Excellent. Dominique?
Acted on feedback after interviews. So we send out candidate experience surveys to get feedback on what the interview process was like so that we can make the experience better for the next person.
Awesome. And I'll throw it on this. I feel like the biggest change that I've made in the interview process is changing the mindset from a test to an exploration. Like it is an exploration that you have with your candidate and not a test. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. This has been super, super fun. I think there might be a hangout for the speakers where other folks can ask Q&A afterwards. But again, I want to thank our panelists, everyone for joining, and we'll see you all online and in Slack. Take care, y'all.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.